In the Renaissance, we could think about a number of new ideas that come in from the imitation of speech, the rhythms of speech. In many madrigals, you get this kind of thing. Monteverdi, Marenzio, many others start to now declaim texts. And so the rhythm of speech is a very important thing. The rhythm of dance is very important. I alluded to the way that popular music probably influences a number of different patterns as far as modality are concerned. It's very definitely influencing how music works, and a composer like Marenzio or Arctel is kind of sampling the world of popular song and drawing up these lively rhythms. When we get to English madrigals, the ballets and all the fa la las, these draw on a tradition of Italian canzonettas, they were called. These were sort of light tunes and had light, sprightly rhythms that went with them. But if we peel those back, what we find is that the musical notation and a lot of the sacred polyphony really still operates under not the time of speech and not the time of gesture or movement, but instead the time of abstraction and number. And this is epitomized in the mensural system of notation, which involves hierarchical levels of triple and duple divisions of time. So we'll just take a look at this. This is kind of the time space. This is a little chart put together by my colleague Ted Dumitrescu, who's a very fine musicologist and also a computer scientist and a good typographer. And what we see here are the various symbols. The most familiar to us would be right in the middle of the page, the semibreve, which, although shaped like a lozenge, is our whole note. And the note shapes that go below it, we're going smaller and smaller in time, look a lot like, well, half note, quarter note, eighth note, and 16th note. They have different names, and below them you can see the rest forms. Anyone who's studied music knows that when you write a whole rest, it hangs from the line above it. And in fact, that's just a widened version of what we see in this symbol, which is a little half a space filled in. And half note rest sits on the line. This is also a half of the space filled in, but it is lower down and therefore smaller. And you can actually see the little flags that come in are the origin of our eighth note and 16th note rests. Our British colleagues still call these notes semibreve, minim, fusa, semi-minim, hemi-semi-minim, all those terms. But for North American readers, these are semibreve, whole note, half note, and so on. And of course, there's a semibreve, there must be a breve. And as great evidence of inflation on a kind of cosmic as well as musical scale, the semibreve is the shortest, the half version of the note called a breve, which was the Latin term for a short note. Because back in the world of the 12th century, the notes were either long or short, a longa or a brevis. Now, in fact, they also imagined a maxi longa, double long. And so what you had was very wide range of temporal values, far longer than we would imagine here. We might encounter this in orchestral music. We would see people playing short notes, Stravinsky, short notes and long notes of that range simultaneously. But in addition to those note shapes, we had these note shapes understood under a system of what was called mensuration. Now, in some ways, it's very familiar to us because it involves the hierarchical presentation of duple or triple divisions of some time space. So you can think of this time, a measure, as being a tempus. That's what they called it. A measure was a tempus. And the tempus consisted of one breve. A breve took up the time of one tempus. And you can see on the right-hand side, the square note is the breve, which you can divide into different levels of either 2 or 3. So the first horizontal slice is the breve into 2 whole notes, or semibreves, and those into 2 minims. Or you could divide the breve into 2 semibreves, and then divide those into 3 minims. So it's duple at the first level, and either duple or triple at the level below. And you can do the other combination, which is you divide the breve into 3, and then those 3 into 2, or into 3 and those 3 into 3. So you got all the combinations of 2 and 3 at each level, and those have Latin terms. And the Latin terms are very interesting because they betray, and this goes back to the 13th century, Christological thinking. They actually justified the understanding of time as perfect time was 3 because of the Trinity.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
And if you only had 2, that was imperfect. So this was a kind of maybe a musical fact that they justified by appeal to a theological concept.
Right.
Right? That's what I mean by the kind of the ground of language or the ground of the theory sort of explains what's going on. And then they came up with signs that would abbreviate these. A circle being perfection because it's complete, and either a absence of a circle or an open circle would be imperfection. And so they could notate not only through terminology, tempus imperfectum, and they called this lower level prolation. Minor prolatio meant small groups, 2s, and major prolatio meant 3. So you could have imperfect time and minor prolation, imperfect time, major prolation, etc. Or you could just save yourself a few words and write a sign.
Yeah.
C, which we always think of as common time, right? Every musician learns C means common time, which means 4/4. It doesn't mean common time. C means imperfect time, and the lack of a dot in the middle means minor prolation. And so, as I suggest in red over at the left, that's like 4/4.
Yeah.
And 6/8 is like dot 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 dot. You see, it's 2 at the top level and 3 beneath it. Or you could take the same 6 beats and go dot 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 dot. It's 3, but consisting of 2. Or you can do compound meters like 6/8 or 9/8. Dot 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 dot.
Yeah.
Then it goes crazy, because now they can also take that time, which is a very slow time, in fact. It doesn't go as fast as I just said it. It's very slow perceptually, because the beat is at the semi-breve. So one breve is ba, da, is one breve. But they can make it faster and make by cutting it, put a line through the middle, a slice down the middle, which means everything is twice as fast as it was. It's a diminution. And so it says the beat, instead of being that subbeat on the semi-breves, da, da, you put a cut down the middle, it speeds it up, and the beat is at the breve. And when you see cut C, what does it say in a Handel score or Beethoven or Brahms? It says à la breve.
Yeah.
And what à la breve means is the beat is on the breve, not on the semi-breve.
Yeah.
Twice as fast. So you can do these cut signs, and they go crazy. They do proportionate signs. It is insane. It's like a mathematics is what happens, and they can have multiple divisions, multiple meters going on at the same time. And you have like the tenor melody is going at some glacial pace, and the other melodies are in a different meter. It's like Elliott Carter or something, right? It's like multi-meters is what's going on.
Yeah, right. Well, we have in one of the episodes in this chapter, the Ocagum Missa Prolationum, where, again, each voice feels what we would call being in a different meter, and yet everything lines up perfectly well.
Yep, exactly. So they would use this kind of ground of time to generate pieces that were, in some ways, as we were talking about before, is inconceivable without the system of notation, right? And in some ways, the system of notation was generating that polyphony.
Right.
And there are some pieces, in fact, that are actually notated in a way that is extremely complicated and abstruse, but they sound perfectly simple. Sometimes they went out of their way to write it down in a more complicated way than was necessary, which suggests a kind of intellectual game maybe for what was going on, that the sign and the sound were not necessarily the same thing. It wasn't just a way of recording music, but it was a way of representing music or representing musical time. So here is from the middle years of the 16th century when print gets going. A lot of this actually becomes quite simple. This is like the Morley. If you look at this is from mid 16th century Paris. Is actually a digital project that I'm working on where we edit and recompose and discuss these pieces. But you see over here, this is a Q, the first letter of the text. That's a clef. Then cut C, and then we have a semibreve, two minims, and a semibreve with a dot next to it. Ya da 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 da. You can learn to read this very easily. It's very comprehensible. Other than the clef, a modern musician has very little trouble learning to sing this material. There's no bar lines, there's no ficta, but it's actually not so bad by the 16th century. And that makes sense because this burgeoning print trade was going along with an increase in literacy. And you certainly wouldn't want your middle class or successful musical amateurs buying music that was impossible to sing. It had to be reasonable. So the mensural system isn't necessarily that complex. And in fact, when you looked at that Morley example that we had at the beginning of this little talk, that's quite comprehensible as well. And in fact, the Morley doesn't even have the problems of the clefs. It's all in G clefs. So you could pick up that Morley example and learn to sing it with no trouble. And a lot of people do sing from original notation in this way. Not all pieces are that simple. This is Josquin's Le Marmay. I'm sorry for the slightly skewed image there. It's partly to represent the manuscript from which it comes. We have at the top of the page the cantus part. This is only 2 of 4 voices. Cantus part, and then the tenor part. You can actually see tenor, it says over here. And each of these voices is singing the Le Marmay tune. Ya da 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 dum. But the tenor is actually in a completely different mensuration than the cantus part. The tenor, it's not evident from the way it's notated here, is moving much more slowly. It is actually evident when you think about it, because we have to turn the page simultaneously at the end of this movement, and you can see how many more notes are written down in the cantus part than the tenor. And that's the first clue that the tenor is going very, very slowly, while the cantus part is going over top of it. And in fact, they are both singing the same tune. This information and this information are exactly the same series of notes, but they come out in 2 different mensurations, because this mensuration is not only slower, but it has a dot in the middle. You see that little dot in the middle of the circle? So the division at the lower level is a 3-ness, whereas the one at the top is not only going faster, but the lack of a dot means that its divisions are 2, and the notes actually come out the same shape, means a different thing under the different mensuration signs. It's kind of the equivalent of musica ficta. It looks like a minim, but you actually won't know how long it is until you figure out what mensuration sign it's operating under. And that's how Ocagum can write one line and put 4 symbols at the beginning, and they all work differently. Because actually the symbol changes its durational meaning according to its neighbors and the thing that's before it. The sign that's before it, yeah.
It's contextual. And the both singers could be looking at this page at the same time?
Oh, sure. This was a choir book that sat on a big stand. There would be 2 more voices, the alto and the bass, and everyone read from their own part. And they probably stayed together. You actually see this in various images of choirs assembled. We don't necessarily believe that they're perfectly like a photo, that they are a perfect representation of what was going on. But you very often see in these images of a group of singers around a page like this in a manuscript or a painting, that one of them has his arm on the shoulder of the other. The guy behind has his arm on the shoulder of the other. And they're not just pals. I think it's pretty clear from theoretical sources. I can't do it to myself, but the one guy is tapping the time on the other one's shoulder. And that's how they didn't conduct. They would keep time this way. And maybe the other would tap with his fellow, and they would keep in time that way. Through some basic pulse that would keep everybody else together. How they sang these fiendishly difficult multiple canonic pieces is I guess anybody's guess, but it tells you the great skill and that they had, and also probably simply they grew up in this system since the time they were 8 years old reading this mensural notation. They didn't think in terms of bars. They didn't think in terms of harmonies and scores and Mozart and all those other kind of ways of understanding music. They thought this linear music, it was basically like a native language to them. Right? And they could do it. They probably could sing these a certain amount at sight. Yeah. So we have some very virtuosic pieces. This is the realization of that same moment that we were just talking about. It is a canon, and you can see from this modern edition that the top facsimile here is the part in red. The bottom facsimile is in blue, and you can see that they are the same note shapes, but they're in different time scales altogether. And if you went further into the piece, you'd actually find that some of the notes actually come out differently. For instance, right here, these two notes, yadam, right over here, come out differently in the different meters as they're presented. It's a little bit hard to see what's happening. Maybe it doesn't happen in this passage. But there are other passages where the two notes together, because this has been decorated, is what's happened. But there are two notes together, the same pattern will come out as different rhythms underneath different signs. Yeah. Yeah. It's not the perfect example here, but you would have to believe me. The one set of symbols produces two different mensural patterns, but also the individual signs can work differently. And then here's like the Ocagum, and in fact this piece actually alludes to Ocagum in one of the subsidiary melodies. This is from the same mass, from the Marmay Mass by Josquin, in which now a mid-16th century music theorist is citing this as an example of Josquin kind of going over the top, is what he says. He says, this is too much. And what Josquin did was write down one melody, put three different mensuration signs in front of it, and you can see from the modern edition that's on the page, what happens is they all begin together. In the previous piece, they start at different points. This one, they start at different times. The soprano or cantus part starts before the tenor, and the tenor slowly catches up, and they wind up in the same place. Here they all begin at the same time, and because they're written in different mensurations, they slowly diverge, but they are all the same melodic line. And the point here is that under the different mensuration signs, the various symbols mean different things. And you can see that the soprano part is 3 Ds and an F, and comes in under 1, 2, 3, 1. Well, the bass part is also 3 Ds and an F, but because it operates under a different mensuration sign, it's dum, 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 dum. Yeah. Same signs, different meanings. And
so the bass is duple, right? Duple, and the superios is in the triple.
Is in triple, and so like the bar lines that I've put between the staves are kind of a fiction, right? They don't actually exist in each of those parts, not at that spot. They don't exist in that piece. The bar line that I've put in between the third D of the soprano and the F, and between the second D and the third D of the bass, that's not one spot. They should be in different spots, effectively.
Correct. Yeah, right. But to our modern eyes,
they must be there, right? Yeah. So it's a very interesting effect, is what's happened. The breves are of different length, is what that's happening, and because you see the two outer parts are moving more quickly, the middle part is the one that does not have the slash sign through the C up in the original source. The top and the bottom are moving more quickly, which is what they're doing. They're cut C3 or cut C. The other one is at original note value, so it's much slower. It's not moving at the same pace. And so you get the 3 A's and then a C. It's a different transposition. And the kicker here is that the original source gives you a clef on the pitch, the C clef, showing you that the first note is a D, but it does not explain to you how to derive that in fact one of the voices doesn't start on D but starts on A. You have to figure that out all by yourself. And then you can lastly see in this piece, since they all begin together but go at different times, you see this little curly Q called a Sinium. It's like a little coda tail. It's like a dal segno sign in a modern source. It's over a note and here's another one over a note. And what that's saying is the slow middle voice only needs to get up to here and it's done. And the next voice that moves, the bassus voice that moves a little more quickly, needs to get up to here and then it's done. And the top voice, which moves the fastest of all, is going to take all the way out to here. But notice how Josquin's kind of cheating a little bit. By the time he gets to this spot where the other two voices just have to sit on a note, he really can't write very many pitches, can he?
Yeah.
Right? He's stuck writing, they both wind up on a D at this point. And so the only thing he can do is wobble between D and A is all he can do when he gets to the end of the piece. So the cantus part spends the last part of the piece just going, because the other voices are stuck doing that, and you can't write anything else.
Right, okay.
So it kind of falls apart after a while. To say that it's a divergent canon is a little bit of a fiction.
Okay. Only because the end doesn't work, but the rest...
It all works. It's just by the time he runs out of notes with the first two voices, if he wanted to let them stop singing, you could write whatever you liked. But in fact, it's only a mensuration canon up to, I suppose, up to here.
Right.
Or maybe up to here, in the sense of all the voices singing the same thing.
Yeah, I think a lot of us and a lot of our listeners are probably familiar with these sorts of games that Bach played. And maybe don't realize that there's a long lineage to this kind of, very long lineage to that kind of writing.
Definitely. You think of the chorale cantus firmus tradition in Bach. He is drawing on that medieval tradition of putting the melody in the tenor and lending significance to a cyclic cantata or a chorale cantus firmus in an organ piece. These are very medieval techniques heard through the lens of modern tonality, right? And Bach, yes, he's often sort of thought about as a kind of progressive and very advanced, but in many other ways he is a, I don't want to say a conservative, but an accumulator of old techniques, of old principles. And musicians are conservative people. We don't really change our symbols that much. If you think about this, the idea that we could take the Josquin piece and recognize the shapes for what they are tells us that we're part of a 1,000-year tradition. And this tradition of musical notation as part of this sophisticated space through which artful music is understood, and it's a written as much as an oral tradition, I think is what is unique about the Western tradition. There are many very sophisticated, both rhythmically and melodically, extremely rich traditions around the world, but they use notation in a completely different way. It's either just a mnemonic device or it's a tablature. But composition is not refactored through the written space in the same way. It's an aid, that notation, when you have to mark it down or write it down. But they're extremely rich and sophisticated oral traditions. They just don't have this baggage as well as this particular investment in the written page as what's going on. How do we want to put it? There is such a thing as silently looking at a score and studying it in the Western tradition.
Right.
That's a thing you do. Not just to reproduce, you look for patterns in it and do analysis with it. And that largely does not exist in traditions that are mediated either orally or by tablatures of various kinds.
Right, right. That's really fascinating. And this Western tradition began more with the actual action of making the music, that orally learned and learning by doing, but it morphed over time into relying more and more on the written, on the theory.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, its association with the church is certainly part of this, and of course the texts that we have, this system of writing, although it has some connections with cantillation coming out of antiquity and cantillation in Jewish tradition, it has connections with those symbols for cantillation. It became a written tradition in the years around 1000, where we see a big transformation of chant manuscripts that had maybe preserved the texts of chants, now increasingly writing down the melodies, and then writing down the melodies in a way that were not just indicators of general contour, but started to preserve fixed pitch information. And so that period between about 1000 and about 1200, these are very approximate numbers, people are writing down the pitch content of music, and there is yet no reliable system for notating time. But then they get about notating time, and that happens as people start to write down polyphony. Surely people were singing and playing polyphonic music in many, many contexts before and after that did not require anything to be notated. But in this particular tradition, it became very invested in that. And I think reproduced because of the literate and text-based culture of the church, and the way that the church actually kind of, I would say, sacralized many of these figurae, many of these patterns. You could add new meanings to them, but you couldn't change them, was the thing. And I think that betrays a certain conservatism that's at work.
Yeah, really fascinating perspective. Yeah.
Okay, that's probably a lot for today.
Yeah. Well, it's so amazing to sort of dive into the way that this works, and to begin to at least get a sense of how this music was conceived in the brains of the practitioners of that time, which is pretty fundamentally different from how we think of music today. I mean, obviously there's some overlap. We can understand the hexachord system, we can understand the prolations, but it is not how musicians like I have been taught to read these things. And we feel tonality has this inexorable pull toward a home pitch, which is sometimes we want to place that on this music because that's how we just hear it. But really, it's this other method happening there. And so just to even get to begin to understand that, it really opens up how even just a listener, a casual, interested listener, can hear this music in a new way. So
that's right. I mean, I don't think that we'll unhear Mahler or unhear Brahms in listening to this music, and I would not suggest that we attempt to do that, and I wouldn't suggest that musicians attempt to peel away all of their impulses and all of their understanding and concepts as they try to make sense of this music. But I do think it's valuable to imagine how someone grappling with these musical works in a different place, perhaps, and certainly in a different time, might have approached them with a different set of assumptions. And that, I think, becomes a cue for us to re-examine our own assumptions. In other words, not that we can escape them, but at least we examine what they are and become a little more aware of them. And that's why I find it interesting to study this music, is not necessarily to reproduce it, but to attempt some understanding of it, and through it, some understanding of my own perspectives.
That's a beautiful thing, and what a great way to end there is examining our assumptions.
Excellent. And hearing some nice music, too.
Right. Yeah.
Great.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Freedman. It's been such a pleasure to have you explain this to us. And,
yeah. The pleasure is mine. Anyone who's willing to listen to me talk about this stuff is a friend of mine.
Yeah. Well, with that, we'll see you in other aspects of our series. And thank you so much again for this. And I guess it's time to sign off.
Okay, my pleasure. Take care.